This week, for our trip to the national parks, we head to the wide open spaces of Nebraska to the Homestead National Historical Park near Beatrice, Nebraska. This is about 40 miles south of the capital Lincoln in the southeast corner of the state. Through the early 1800s, most settlement in the early United States had been in forested land that needed to be arduously cleared by hand, but as people pushed out into the lands of the Louisiana Purchase, with visions of free soil promised to them, they looked out on a great grass desert. Not a tree in sight. The rush for land to homestead and create a home place was begun by President Lincoln in 1862. To qualify for purchasing land at this time, you had to be a citizen of the U.S. or declare officially that you would become one, and you had to have never taken up arms against the United States. Later homesteading acts would add more limitations, and the homestead years would continue all the way into the 1980s for land in Alaska. There are also rules to help limit land speculation that kind of worked. Well, the National Homestead Museum is on the land of one of the earliest homesteads in the granted land. It is largely a place dedicated to looking at how many lives of people living in the United States have been touched by homesteading. Approximately 1/3 of Americans have an ancestor that homesteaded for at least some time, which means they also have some pretty impressive genealogical research tools on site. The park also has information on the failure rate of homesteading and just how hard it was to start absolutely from scratch, especially in a day when you're going to be doing all of the land clearing and well digging by hand and animal power. I mean, how deep a hole can you dig in a day? And how would you find a spot for a well anyway? Slightly terrifying decisions when you stop and think about it. Exhibits at the park cover both the people who moved onto the land to make it a home and those who already lived there and were pushed off. Stories of both Plains tribes and Eastern tribes relocated to the prairie come into the story. And the site of the park gives a reasonable sense of just how far and alone the prairie was. Sure, you drove there in a nice comfy car, but go for the 3-mile hike around the site to see how alone you can be. And it's worth it. The prairie bird life is worth seeing, as are the spring flowers. And the grass in the hot summer also has a unique toasty scent of its own. To really get a sense of just how very big the country is, and what starting from an empty piece of land really looks like, swing by the Homestead National Park near Beatrice, Nebraska. And you can think about the change that the motorized tractor is going to bring to this sea of grasses. Episode 172, The Potato, A History. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'm doing a deep dive into the potato, specifically the savory potato, not the sweet one. You'll get to find out how the potato traveled the world, how it changed the philosophy of agriculture in Europe at least twice, and how it got to go to the United States multiple times, and why Americans for decades called this tuber from the Andes the Irish potato. To learn about all this and more, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that wild potatoes are poisonous, and so are some of the varieties grown to be eaten by humans. But you won't find any of them anywhere near an American or even a European grocery store. In fact, the poisonous varieties are only found in the village markets on the western slopes of the Andes Mountains, near the origination point of our hero of the episode, the potato. And they're sold alongside a fixative or adsorbent for these poisonous compounds, a local clay, that is eaten as sort of a sauce with the poisoned potatoes. Potatoes themselves have been rattling around the Andes for about 9 million years. A research project that pulled together a global coalition of scientists from the US, China, Canada, Germany, and the UK dug into the weirdo genetics of the plant to figure out how it got that way and how long ago it happened. As a former chemistry teacher with a strong affection for biology, this is a gripping story. But as a person who came to hear about potatoes, well, I'll skip ahead. Basically, potatoes are hard to breed into new varieties, but we need to do that as we are facing some dramatic changes to our global climate. The good news is that the land races, or different varieties, once they are established, are very stable. But the bad news is that trying to make new ones happen is a pain. And much of that comes from the fact that potatoes are tetraploid. That is, they have 4 copies of each chromosome, while most living things have 2 copies of each chromosome they possess. Or they're known as diploids. Plant genetics are weird and cool, and there are many puzzles in there. But the potato puzzle is largely due to the fact that a tomato ancestor and the potato ancestor hybridized about 9 million years ago. And instead of tossing out the extra pieces, the plants hoarded all the genes. The result of interest is that it causes a portion of the plant's underground stems to swell, creating the interesting part of the potato. And it also carries around with it a potent cocktail of pest-discouraging chemicals. These findings and more regarding potato origins was published in 2025 in the journal Cell, and I'll link to the articles if anyone wants to look at it more. It just goes to show that science keeps going because of us and our curious monkey brains. But for this podcast, the part that really matters is that early humans in the area figured out that consuming this high-calorie tuber with some of the local clay meant the toxins stuck to the clay, or they could eat it without getting poisoned. Over time, less toxic versions of the potato were bred and grown and spread, until those toxins were relegated to appearing when the potato greened up and started sprouting roots to grow a new plant. Potatoes became the starch of choice in the Andes because they would put up with the persistently cool to cold temperatures of the mountains in ways that more above-ground crops could not, and each elevation and microclimate was filled by a local variety of potato best suited to the job. The result is that today there are about 140 varieties being grown at market scale amounts in South America, with thousands more that are grown on local scales. So how did the savory potato get out of northwestern South America and over to Europe? The sweet potato, or as it is known in Spanish, batata, made its way to Europe first, and as it came from the east coast of South America and it had worked its way out into the Caribbean islands, that was far easier for the Spanish to get at. But how did they get at the savory potato all the way over on the other side? Well, the papa, or savory potato, came to Spanish attention a few decades after they were messing around in the Caribbean, due to the Pizarro expedition through the Panama Isthmus to the west coast of South America. Like many of his ilk, Francisco Pizarro was chasing rumors of golden cities and treasures worth plundering. His early bashing about did not find El Dorado or even that mountain of silver in Potosi, Bolivia, that would soon run the fortunes of the Spanish Empire and change the global silver situation. But he did bring back papas, potatoes, and those would end up being the main food that would feed the workers who dug the silver that was sent to Spain. The potato would also go back to Spain, and since it does contain useful amounts of vitamin C, along with its starchy calorie goodness, it worked as an anti-scorbutic. That is, eat your potatoes so you don't get scurvy. Potatoes didn't grow very well in most of Spain, too warm, too dry. But they did do well in the northwestern corner of Spain, inhabited by another group of stubborn, mountain-dwelling people, the Basques. So before the 16th century came to an end, the durable combination of potatoes and salt cod was born. And it's also why Basque cuisine is full of potatoes. They are, after all, the European region where potatoes have been hanging out for the longest. Over the centuries, we know that cod-fishing people run into and hang out with other cod-fishing people. And so it was with the people living on the west coast of Ireland. It seems that potatoes were introduced to the Irish a few times by a few different encounters of the Basque and Spanish and the Irish. Not only were the cod fishers stopping in Ireland to dry catches and salt them down, Spanish traders were engaged in trade of wine and cloth, and likely a few potatoes as well. And the moist, cool Irish weather was, potato heaven. The Spanish were particularly peripatetic in those days, so they also dropped potatoes off in China, India, and West Africa. And because the potato crops in each of these places came from only a few starter potatoes, each of these local potato varieties initially suffered from founder effect or bottleneck effects. That is, they had limited genetic diversity. That is, like 2 or 10 varieties of potato rather than the dozens, hundreds, and thousands growing back in their homeland. This was exacerbated by the fact that potatoes tend to be clones of each other. Most potatoes are grown from the roots sprouting from the tuber eyes rather than from seeds that are found in potato fruits. Now, potato fruits are put out by the above ground part of the plant. And the fact that so many potatoes growing in a region are clones of each other, it will become a problem, but that's later. Another place the Spanish took the potato was the Netherlands, because something Habsburg, something Holy Roman Empire meant that the Spanish crown had an interest in ruling the Dutch from the end of the 1500s until 1714. Because of that, a few Spanish things found their way into the Dutch orbit, one of them being potatoes. Again, due to a variety of factors, but largely because the Netherlands, like Ireland, is moist and cool, and the potatoes like it. When the Dutch finally kicked out the Spanish and Europe dissolved into a mess of wars in the 1700s and 1800s, the Spanish army ended up spreading potatoes all over the place. Notably, once the Spanish were kicked out of the Netherlands, they landed in Italy to march north and try to take it back, again, dropping off potatoes and laying the groundwork for gnocchi. Potatoes would continue to spread around Central and Eastern Europe due to marching armies leaving some of their provisions around. I mean, after all, you just need a chunk of potato with an eye in it, and you'll get a potato plant. And once the peasants who were under attack from roving soldiers requisitioning all their grain, cows, chickens, and anything else not nailed down, figured out how to grow potatoes, they became big fans. Potatoes were noticeably tastier and more filling than other root crops like turnips, beets, and rutabagas. But more than that, they could be left underground longer and could be stored buried. And this meant they were more of a pain for foraging soldiers to dig up, unlike bags of grain, which they would simply grab. It was also much easier to have hidden caches of potatoes in times of war, whereas buried bags of grain tended to go bad. So for the peasantry in the path of marauding armies, potatoes meant the difference between starvation and survival. This patchy adoption of the potato did mean that they were grown mainly, in the beginning, as an accessory crop. They were not a main crop like wheat or barley. Traditions and rules about planting, letting fields lie fallow, and crop rotation didn't initially have any space for the entry of potatoes as a main crop during the first half of the 1700s. However, as a series of bad weather hit, intermingled with war devastation, potatoes were able to rise up as a main crop. And one of the earliest wide adoptions of the potato was in Prussia, following a famine there in 1744. This would secure the Kartoffel, or Erdapfel, as a base of German cookery. The name Erdapfel is literally earth apple, and it's the same derivation as the French pomme de terre, apple of the earth, whereas Kartoffel designates the potato as some variety of truffle, that buried mushroom or fungus so treasured throughout Europe. And it does make a sort of sense. The notes from Pizarro's expedition describing their first encounters with the potato also described it as some sort of truffle. Potatoes of that time were much smaller than our modern monster-sized baking potatoes and had markedly irregular surfaces. And of course, in the face of no running water, were covered with a light dusting of dirt. Now, part of the old Prussian Empire encompassed modern Ukraine, and the potato did not thrive there, as those wide plains were too arid to support the moisture-loving potato. However, other parts of Eastern Europe would take it up gladly, notably Poland and the Baltic states. There are other tales and explanations of the adoption of the potato in France and the resistance to the potato in England, as there it was seen as a harbinger of popery. After all, the potato's not mentioned in the Bible, an argument made at one time or another regarding just about every other introduced foodstuff, from tea and coffee to coconuts and tomatoes. But anyway, thinking the potato might possibly be dangerous was not entirely unreasonable. Going back to the beginning, thinking about how the modern potato is selectively bred from the tuber-producing hybrid of the proto-potato and tomato, well, the reason these two plants could hybridize is that they are closely related as plants go. They are both from one arm of the Solanaceae family, known generally as nightshades, especially to Europeans. A long time ago, when the earth was young, all the land was together in one great continent. You remember, Pangaea. 200 million years ago, it began to break apart into the continents we now know and love and fight about today. Flowering plants, on the other hand, have been around for about 475 million years. So the progenitors of the Solanaceae were all together at one point, but got scattered hither and yon, which explains why nightshade and eggplant and potatoes and tomatoes and tobacco and capsicums, or chili peppers, can all be related, but seem to have sprung from so many different places around the globe. Anyway, for all their humble-looking dirt-dusted tubers, the potato has a pretty flashy flower. It's an attractive purple 5-pointed star. And in an age where flowers were cultivated and used in their ever-changing seasonal rotations, the potato flower was a welcome addition. And because so many people also had close knowledge of a wide variety of flowers, leaves, and plants, as they were a constant and important part of everyday life, it was easy to see the close kinship of the potato to its distant toxic cousin. It also didn't help that the fruits produced by the potato flower, and that's where you find the actual potato seeds, those fruits are quite poisonous, to the point where they can even harm livestock. Feeding your cows parts of farm plants humans didn't eat was quite common, if not an essential part of the working of a pre-industrial farm. While corn stalks could be added to cow feed and pig feed, and the entire edibleness of corn helped it spread quickly and easily, the fact that you had to ensure potato fruits were not fed to cows and pigs also made it initially a less popular plant. For what it's worth, potato leaves seem to be okay for livestock, especially if they're mixed in with other fodder. Humans should not eat savory potato leaves or fruits, for goodness sake. But what makes it confusing for some people is that sweet potato leaves, which are from an entirely different family, are just fine to eat and actually kind of tasty, for what it's worth. But the positives of the savory potato definitely overcame the problems. See, there is a reality of the agricultural life. I ranted a little about it in the last episode, and I will say more here. Hunger was an ever-present threat in agricultural life. It was typical for there to be a famine year caused by war or weather or insects or what have you about every 10 years. This is a point made in the Bible. It's a point of commonality brought up in the TV show Shogun between feudal England and feudal Japan. Every place with recorded ancestral stories or myths or what have you has a mention of the somewhat regular recurrence of years of famine and want. And this is in addition to the annual cycle of plenty in late summer and fall, plus the hungry times of late winter and early spring. The arrival of the potato added in a new niche of food. Another layer of safety was added to the food rotations of Europe. It's estimated that potatoes effectively doubled Europe's food supply, and this is part of the reason why the population of Europe jumped in the 200 years between the 1600s and the 1800s. It's not that people were necessarily having more children, it's just that more of them were surviving. Now, lots of factors are responsible for the explosion of the sciences and the birth of the mechanical age. I've talked about coffee and tea partly edging out beer and wine to change how people spent their free time. There was the marine compass and the sextant, which increased whaling, making it so you could do more things by artificial light. That was part of it too. But the fact that not so many people had to spend not so much time to make enough food or closer to enough food meant that there were more people who could spend more time cogitating on things like metal alloys and gear ratios and steam pumps and the curves inside of barrels to come up with the fantastical machines that would power the industrial age. Potatoes were the food fed to workers who mined silver in Bolivia that paid for the rise of the Spanish Empire. Potatoes were the food that allowed more Europeans to survive in the face of food disasters that used to wipe them out. And potatoes in some places would become almost the sole food, keeping an incredibly extractive state of affairs going on much longer than it could have otherwise. I've now covered how potatoes got out of their home region of what is now Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and I've given a short explanation of how potatoes got to Ireland and spread around Europe. So now it's time to talk about how the Irish became so dependent on the potato. First of all, Ireland is wet. The reason it's so emerald green is that there's just absolutely a whole bunch of water falling out of the sky all the time. It's soggy. This means that growing grain there can be a bit of a gamble, as the rain can kick in and make it so the crop rots in the field. On the other hand, the grass and other plants that are good for cows and sheep to graze on also stay plump and healthy. So it has long been a fantastic place to raise livestock. Considering the state of seafaring, my mind still boggles thinking about how those early Celts got their first cattle over there, but they did, and the Irish have been excellent herders for thousands of years. Irish beef and dairy products were and are recognized as exemplary. So much so that the English, tired of mixing it up with the Scots, have repeatedly picked fights with the people one island over, resulting in centuries of strife, which is still not resolved. But we can really lay the blame for the current state of affairs somewhere squarely between King Henry VIII and Oliver Cromwell, two men who really had to lay a messy, dark line across history. Henry, as he saw the Spanish expanding every which way, decided to upset the semi-functional situation in Ireland and stirred up a hornet's nest of trouble. Decades of rebellion, revolt, and reprisals were to follow, making Ireland a headache for a succession of monarchs, but not a single one of them seemed to be able to put it down and walk away. When England executed Charles I in 1649 and tried out life as a monarchless commonwealth under the cranky, colorless rule of one Oliver Cromwell, they may have given up religious feasting and other celebrations, but at least they conquered Ireland? Hooray! The result of this was the death of approximately 40% of the population to plague and famine and some actual war deaths. It also marked an early phase of the Irish diaspora, as large numbers of people marked as prisoners of war and sympathizers were distributed about the English colonies in America and the Caribbean as indentured servants. The depopulated Irish countryside was then distributed to English nobles as rewards for this and that, as you do. They first tried to use the land to grow grain to import back to England, but see above, Ireland. It's very soggy, and in most places was not the best place to grow grain, especially wheat and barley. So much of the land was converted to pasture to provide beef, salt beef, to the English Navy in its conquest of the oceans. But who do we have to handle all of this cattle we want to grow? Why, the Irish, of course. Now, over time, some grain was grown, and oats were particularly successful, but most of that was exclusively exported. As a result, the landless Irish working the English estates were limited to about a 1-acre plot to grow potatoes, grow a cow for milk, as well as a pig they could later sell for some cash. It is estimated that by the 1800s, the only solid food about 40% of Irish peasants consumed was potatoes, and the rest was milk and foraged greens. So the Irish were intensively farming potatoes, the Prussians on their way to becoming Germans, the English, the French, and so many other people were doing the same. But it was the English and Americans that had the most coastline and were doing the most to run ships around the world to move food and other valuable things from here to there to elsewhere. The rise of steamships and refrigeration and dehydration and concentration, all these new ways to store things for long periods, was making everyone giddy. It was also driving some intensive farming, especially with the goal of making farming a cash-making business instead of just simply a way of keeping everyone around the farm alive. And this meant that fallow fields and plowing in manure and weeds to make a field ready to grow every few years was upended. These people dreaming of the clinking of gold coins figured there had to be a way to make farm soil more productive faster, without all those seasons of resting. Enter guano, bird poop from rocky sea islands, and in this case from islands off the coast of Peru. Yes, we are back to the homeland of potatoes. And in a later episode, I'll go more into the bird poop island wars, but for now, what you really need to know is that the piles of guano that had been accumulating for thousands of years were a pungent yet effective source of nitrogen that was available for plants to use instantly. So it was mined by prisoners of a variety of nationalities and shipped around the world, though mainly to England, Ireland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, as well as the United States, to make it so fields didn't have to rest to recover their productive capability. The result? More food, more profit, and more farmers living on the edge, eating potatoes. And this situation worked, if that's the word we want to use, for a while. But remember, germ theory was still not a thing. While disease and contamination and rotting were all understood to happen, the mechanism of how exactly what was going on was not known. So cleanliness and anti-contamination measures were certainly not taken as ships traveled from here to there and around and back again. So we have steamships bopping back and forth between Peru, the home of the potato, and Europe, adopted home of the potato. Unsurprisingly, as home of the potato, Peru and surroundings is also home to potato diseases. They may make a few inroads into one potato variety or another, but with 140 market varieties plus thousands of other local varieties running around, all different from village to village, and each village growing a dozen or more varieties of potato to hedge their bets, and the potatoes being of greater and lesser toxicity, a potato disease really has a tough time making any headway. But right around 1845, one of these pathogens, a water mold that would later be named Phytophthora infestans, which translates basically to vexing plant killer, would make its way to Antwerp, Belgium, a hot trading hub if there ever was one. Now, there's no way to secure proof, but it's generally believed that it was one of those Peru-Europe guano trading ships that carried the fateful cargo. This is because the first reports of local potato crops turning to slime were reported in the late spring and early summer of 1845 in that area. By August, it had hopscotched to Paris and the potato fields around central France. This spore-throwing water mold, P. infestans, would spread its purple-black lines in the potato plants of the Netherlands, Denmark, and England. And by September 1845, there were reports of it appearing in Ireland. The potato blight caused by P. infestans would cause hunger and devastation everywhere, but most of the places where it appeared had other crops they could grow, and in the more southerly regions had hot and dry enough summers to kill off most of the blight, especially if no potatoes or tomatoes were present for the mold to live on. However, in Ireland, where the Irish farm labor had been backed into a single corner of potatoes or nothing, added to the fact that the weather was very friendly to the P. infestans spores, the widespread outbreak of the blight lasted from 1845 all the way until 1852, largely because there just weren't enough potatoes for the blight to continue on past that. In the first year of the blight, 1845, about a third of the 2.1 million acres of planted potatoes were affected. And the next year, it was even worse. Of the approximately 8 million people living in Ireland in the 1840s, 1/8, or 1 million of them died of hunger, and 1/4, or about 2 million of them emigrated, largely to the US and Canada and Australia, though plenty went just about anywhere else they could reach. By the end of it, Ireland's population was basically cut in half. The most scarring part of the whole affair, of course, was that there was actually plenty of food growing in Ireland at the time. It was marked for export by the large English landholders, starving people working to grow food that would just be shipped away. And then they themselves were herded off the land and into camps when they couldn't pay their rents. From there, they would be shipped off to emigrate and work as domestic and agricultural labor in places the English had colonized back when they were first picking on the Irish a few centuries before. The Andean potato had been introduced to the United States in the 1790s, but mostly as an experimental and novelty crop in inland northern states. It didn't spread much, as the growing of bread and beer grains was largely going swimmingly. But with the rapid expansion of the country in the 1800s and the then legislated end to slavery, if not its actual end, had people thinking harder about what the best way was to expand the agrarian ideal of Jefferson's yeoman farmer utopia. Obviously, step one was more land. And both the pre- and post-Civil War years had the United States Army actively engaged in doing just that, moving into the Louisiana Purchase and beyond. Oregon Trail, Gold Rush, Boo Mexico and the remnants of the Spanish Empire, all that stuff. What the Army was working in service of was the Homestead Act and a series of other related laws and acts that allowed people of different qualifications to purchase land from the government at extremely low prices. And yes, there will be more on this later as well. Step two, of course, once you had the land, how did you get all of the work done that was necessary? Because it was at this moment that there was a big change in farm labor. Until now, farms for the past 100 years or so had been in an economy where transient and captive labor were both available. Farms that weren't large plantations and didn't have enslaved people or indentured servants would be inhabited by extended families and systems of semi-communal labor that would work together during the busiest times, plantings, weeding, and harvest. It was sort of an all-hands-on-deck situation where people would move farm to farm to get the work done. Or, if it was a large plantation with an enslaved workforce, they would simply all be directed to a single job. But as the population spread out into the Great Wide West, dispersing like drops of ink in a gallon of water, there was also a need for crops that could kind of look after themselves a little better to supplement the needier crops like corn and grain. The influx of Irish, as they found land, also brought along their so-called lazy bedding potato growing methods, and again added another layer to American food safety as well. Sure, Americans might have glorified that we were going out to the Great Plains to grow grain and cows, bread and beef. But believe me, the potatoes came along too. And that is what I will be talking about next week, how the potato went from an edge novelty item to a central pillar of American food, and all in a few decades. It will prove not to be just a major prop for keeping people fed as labor spreads out across the country. The potato also proves essential to getting people in factories as those start to rise up out of the ground. To hear all about that, tune in next week, and thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. If you want to talk to your friends about potatoes, have them listen to this episode, and some other ones, past and present. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.